Hey guys, we're going to explore a topic that's mysterious, fascinating, and deeply profound. You might not believe it, but what's about to unfold could change the way you see a part of history and belief systems we've never truly examined. One small warning: you might not be able to see what you know the same way again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment your location and local time below. I love seeing where you're tuning in from and hearing your thoughts on this topic. Now, relax and let's begin our journey of discovery together. Imagine this. You open the oldest scriptures you can find, and the first thing you notice is not what's written, but what's missing. Whole figures, whole lineages, whole faces are absent. Faces that would have been deep brown, eyes that carried the wisdom of sun-soaked lands, voices that once commanded both the temples and the hearts of their people. There is a deep silence around certain figures, names, and cultures that had fundamental participation in the spiritual narratives we still live by today. This silence is not accidental, it's deliberate, carefully woven into the fabric of what we've been told is truth. If I told you that before the God you grew up hearing about, there were other gods, black gods, seated on thrones of ebony and gold, worshipped for thousands of years, would you believe me? Or would your mind push back, conditioned by decades of teachings that never once mentioned them? This is the moment where curiosity collides with discomfort, where your own sense of spiritual history starts to loosen from its anchors. You begin to notice patterns in the erasure. Sacred texts pass through the hands of translators, each one subtly deciding which details to keep, which to downplay, and which to erase entirely. The absence of black divinity isn't just about missing names, it's about a missing foundation. A whole spiritual architecture was dismantled, stone by stone, until only the structure approved by those in power remained standing. And because you've never seen the original blueprint, you've assumed that this altered temple was the only one that ever existed. But here's the thing. You can't silence every whisper. Even in the most carefully edited histories, you find fragments. A description of skin like polished bronze, a crown shaped like the rising sun, a ritual echoing African harvest festivals. Each fragment is like a note from the past, asking if you're ready to hear the full song again. It makes you wonder why the erasure. Was it fear? Envy? The desire to create a spiritual monopoly? History has shown us that when cultures collide, it's rarely an equal exchange. The more dominant power doesn't just win territory, it rewrites meaning. Black gods weren't just removed, they were replaced. Their stories were rebranded, their symbols repurposed, their very images transformed into something else entirely. The silence is not empty, it's heavy. You can feel the weight of lost memory pressing against the edges of your awareness. You realize that if whole generations have grown up never knowing that these gods existed, they've also grown up never knowing the depth of their own spiritual inheritance. And that kind of forgetting doesn't just erase history, it erodes identity. So if you've ever felt like something's missing in the story you were told, maybe you're right. Maybe you've been walking through the remodeled halls of a sacred house, never knowing there was once a grander palace here, built by hands as dark as the soil that birthed humanity itself. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to start opening locked doors and dusting off the statues hidden behind them. Tell me in the comments, have you ever found a small piece of history that made you question everything else you believed? This is where the first crack in the silence begins. You're not just a listener in this journey, you're a witness, and witnesses have a responsibility. If you see the truth, you can't unsee it. The question is, will you follow it deeper? You step into a world before the erasure, a time when the gods were not distant, faceless abstractions, but radiant beings seated on thrones carved from ebony and gold. Their names were sung into the wind, etched into temple walls and whispered in the prayers of farmers, warriors, and queens. Their skin was the color of the earth itself, deep and rich, a reminder that divinity was not separate from the people, but mirrored in them. Imagine walking through an ancient African city, the air heavy with incense, the streets alive with the sound of drums. Every step takes you closer to the great temple at its center, where priests in brightly woven garments carry offerings to the deity who watches over them. In Egypt, you might find yourself standing before Osiris, a god whose image is painted in shades of deep brown and black, his authority over the afterlife unquestioned. In Nubia, perhaps you'd kneel before Apetamak, the lion-headed war god, whose temples still stand in the sands of modern-day Sudan. These gods were not minor footnotes in history. They were the pillars of entire civilizations. Their temples dominated skylines. Their rituals marked the turning of seasons, the planting of crops, the coronation of rulers. Every victory in battle, every birth, every harvest was tied to their favor. And here's something the edited histories won't tell you. They weren't just worshipped in Africa. Traders, travelers, and conquerors carried their names across deserts and seas, embedding them into the spiritual DNA of neighboring cultures. You can almost feel the confidence of a people who saw themselves reflected in their gods. There was no dissonance between the image of the divine and the faces in the crowd. To them, godhood looked like home. The divine was family. It shared their features, their rhythms, their landscapes. It wasn't an alien ideal imported from far-off lands. It was born from the same sun, drank from the same rivers, and spoke in the same tongues. And then, slowly, the shift began. You start to notice it when you compare statues across centuries. The skin tones lightening, the features changing, the attire altered to match foreign aesthetics. This wasn't evolution, it was transformation with intent. Inscriptions that once celebrated these gods in their full power were chipped away, replaced with symbols and names that fit a new spiritual order. But before that transformation was complete, there was a golden age, a time when black gods sat on thrones not because of conquest, but because their people believed in them without question. Imagine the festivals, the music, the offerings. Picture the walls of the temple glinting under torchlight, covered with scenes of divine triumph, gods guiding kings, gods blessing unions, gods standing guard over the dead. What's striking is how much these gods embodied the full range of human experience. They weren't just gods of war or harvest. They were guardians of justice, creators of order, comforters of the grieving. They were complex, multi-dimensional beings, as nuanced as the people who revered them. And yet, in the version of history most of us inherited, they barely exist, if they appear at all. You might be wondering, if they were so central, how could they be erased so completely? It's a question you should hold on to, because the answer is not simple. Erasure doesn't happen in a single stroke. It happens in layers, over generations, until the memory feels like nothing more than a half-forgotten dream. And once the visible symbols are gone, the spiritual bond begins to fade. Still, the ruins speak. The art speaks. The oral traditions, passed quietly from elders to children, speak. Somewhere deep inside, you know that a god's power doesn't vanish just because someone stops speaking their name. It waits. It waits for someone like you to ask the right questions, to connect the scattered fragments, to breathe life back into the forgotten. So here's my challenge to you. Look at the oldest images of deities you can find from these regions. Pay attention to the skin tones, the facial structures, the clothing. Notice how history has tried to soften or reshape them. Then ask yourself, who benefits from removing a people's reflection from the face of their gods? You might not have the answer yet, but the question alone is enough to crack the next door open. And trust me, what's behind it will change the way you see the entire spiritual landscape. Now, imagine the desert wind brushing against your face as you walk among the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. The sun is fierce, but the air hums with a presence that feels older than the stones beneath your feet. Somewhere beneath the shifting sands, under layers of clay tablets and broken temples, lies another piece of the puzzle: the presence of black divinity in the world's first great civilizations. You've heard the names before: Sumer, Akkad, Babylon. These are the cradles of writing, law, and organized religion. And yet, hidden in their pantheons are echoes of gods whose origins trace back to Africa. Think about it. Human movement didn't stop at the Nile. Trade routes stretched from Nubia into the Fertile Crescent long before recorded history, carrying goods, ideas, and spiritual beliefs. Along with gold, incense, and grain came stories, myths of creators, protectors, and cosmic rulers with dark skin and the power to shape the world. The clues are subtle, but they're there if you're willing to look. On certain Sumerian cylinder seals, you see figures with tightly curled hair, broad noses, and skin shaded darker than those around them. Figures who hold the symbols of rulership or stand in divine authority. In old hymns, you find references to gods whose features were likened to the fertile black soil after the floodwaters receded. These aren't just poetic flourishes, they're markers of origin. You start to realize that cultural boundaries in the ancient world weren't as rigid as we've been taught. A deity could migrate, change names, and blend into another pantheon, much like a traveler adopting a new language but keeping their mother tongue in private. Ninhursag, the Sumerian mother goddess, shares traits with African earth goddesses. Enki, the god of water and creation, carries echoes of African deities tied to rivers and fertility. These similarities aren't coincidences, they're cultural fingerprints. But somewhere along the way, these fingerprints were smudged. As Mesopotamian civilizations rose and fell, as scribes rewrote hymns and priests redefined rituals, the features and origins of these gods began to shift. Depictions lightened, associations with African lands faded, and the gods themselves became increasingly detached from their original cultural roots. And here's where it gets unsettling. Once you start seeing the pattern, you realize it's not just about physical erasure, it's about narrative erasure. If the people who worship a god no longer remember that this god once looked like them, then the power of identification is gone. The god becomes universal in theory, but in practice belongs to no one except those controlling the story. It's not hard to see why this was useful. If you control the image of the divine, you control the hierarchy of the world beneath it. A dark-skinned god in the center of spiritual life affirms the dignity of dark-skinned people. Remove that image, and you weaken the foundation of that dignity. Suddenly, power is easier to consolidate in the hands of those who look nothing like the divine they present. But here's the thing: history can be stubborn. Even when names change and temples crumble, fragments survive in ways no empire can predict. In the back rooms of museums, in untranslated tablets, in folk stories passed quietly among families, the truth is still breathing. The challenge is recognizing it before it slips back into silence. Picture yourself in one of those ancient cities at twilight, standing in the temple courtyard. The air smells of burning cedar and myrrh. A priest chants words you can't fully understand, but you catch a name that sounds like it belongs to another place, another river, another sun. That's the moment you realize the lines between Africa and Mesopotamia were not lines at all, but threads in the same tapestry. This is why I'm asking you to pay attention. Look deeper into the myths you thought were separate. Compare their symbols, their sacred animals, their creation stories. You'll start to see the overlap, and when you do, you'll understand that the erasure we're talking about wasn't just African, it was global. The same hand that softened the African gods in Egyptian records was at work in the clay libraries of Sumer. Tell me, have you ever read two myths from different cultures and felt like they were telling the same story in different words? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I think you might be seeing the invisible bridges that connect them. And once you see those bridges, you can never again pretend the continents were spiritually isolated. You're standing at the crossroads of spiritual history, watching something that feels almost impossible. An entire pantheon fading from sight, replaced not by accident, but by design. This is the great spiritual displacement, the moment when the many became one. And not just any one, but a singular God, crafted and refined to erase the memory of all who came before. Picture this: a temple filled with statues of many gods, warriors, mothers, healers, judges, each with their own rituals, followers, and domains. They stand side by side, their differences creating a spiritual landscape as rich as the earth itself. Then, over time, the statues begin to vanish. Not all at once. First one disappears, then another. Priests stop mentioning certain names. The festivals shrink, the songs grow quieter. Eventually, when a child asks about a particular god, the elder pauses, frowns, and changes the subject. This wasn't just a shift in belief, it was a deliberate campaign. You see, when you replace many gods with one, you're not just changing theology, you're centralizing authority. In a polytheistic system, power is distributed: different temples, different regions, different leaders. In a monotheistic system, power flows upward, condensing like water into a single vessel, and whoever holds that vessel controls not only religion, but politics, culture, and history itself. For the black gods, this was a death sentence in slow motion. Their stories were absorbed into the new narrative, their powers reassigned, their symbols recycled. The new god, often Yahweh in this rewriting, was built not just as a spiritual figure, but as a political one. And here's the unspoken truth: the qualities that didn't align with the emerging image of this god were quietly stripped away. If a god's dark skin, African features, or local traditions didn't fit the agenda, they simply vanished from the record. And yet, if you read carefully, you can see the fingerprints of the old god still clinging to the new one. Attributes like justice, fertility, and protection didn't appear from nowhere. They were inherited, rebranded, and reassigned. Think of it as spiritual plagiarism on a massive scale. The ancient African deities didn't simply vanish. They were edited into a form that stripped them of their origin while keeping their usefulness. What's most haunting is the psychological impact. Imagine a people who once saw themselves in the divine, now told that the divine looks nothing like them. That kind of disconnection is more than symbolic. It seeps into how you value yourself, your culture, your worth. It's like someone took a mirror, replaced it with a painting of a stranger, and insisted it's you. You might ask, how could people accept such a change? The answer is time. When transformation happens over generations, it doesn't feel like theft. It feels like evolution. A child born into the new system doesn't know what's missing, and the elders who do remember are too few, too quiet, or too fearful to resist. Over time, the replacement becomes truth, and the original fades into myth, then into nothing. But here's where you come in. If you're listening to this now, you're part of a generation that can reverse that flow. You have access to fragments your ancestors could only dream of: artifacts in museums, digitized manuscripts, global archives, and cross-cultural research. The tools to uncover the erased are in your hands, but the choice to use them is yours. Ask yourself, what does it mean to restore not just the names, but the presence of these gods in our collective memory? Would it challenge what you believe today? Would it make you question the image of God you grew up with? Or would it enrich it, showing you that divinity has always been bigger than any single story? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the conversation we're having now isn't just academic. It's spiritual archaeology. And if we keep digging, we might just find that the gods we thought were gone have been here the whole time, waiting for us to remember. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the image of a god you grew up seeing on church walls, in children's books, in the paintings that hang in museums. Now strip away everything you've been told about that image and ask yourself, why does the divine look the way it does? Whose decision was it to paint it like that? And perhaps most importantly, who was erased to make room for it? Skin, symbol, and sacred power have always been intertwined. In the ancient world, a god's image was not just a matter of artistic choice, it was a declaration of authority, an embodiment of cultural identity. When African civilizations depicted their gods with skin as dark as fertile soil, they weren't making a casual aesthetic choice. They were affirming the sacredness of their own people, their landscapes, their bloodlines. You can almost feel the pride radiating from those depictions, the black skin gleaming under gold jewelry, the coal-lined eyes watching over worshippers, and the powerful stances surrounded by sacred animals. In these images, color was more than pigment, it was theology. Dark skin was not merely included in divinity, it was a mark of it. Now, think about what happens when that image is altered, when the skin lightens, when the hair straightens, when the clothes shift from African linen and leather to foreign fabrics, when sacred animals associated with the Nile or the savannah are replaced with symbols from entirely different climates. This is not just artistic reinterpretation, it's cultural displacement on a spiritual level. In sacred texts, the manipulation is even subtler. Descriptions become vague or metaphorical. A deity once praised for skin like polished bronze now has that line omitted. A god's homeland, once clearly linked to African geography, becomes a distant land without specifics. Little by little, the god loses their physical identity, and with it, the connection to a specific people. This isn't just about removing blackness, it's about removing ownership. If a god can be made to look like anyone, they can be claimed by anyone. And if they can be claimed by anyone, those in power can reshape them into a reflection of themselves, cementing their authority as the chosen or the closest to the divine. The loss here is immeasurable. When a people's gods no longer look like them, the divine becomes something external, something you have to reach for, rather than something that already lives within you. You stop seeing your features as sacred. You stop believing that your skin, your hair, your culture could ever be the image of perfection. But this is not the end of the story. Because once you start seeing the pattern, you start reclaiming it. You start looking at old art with new eyes. You spot the original features hidden under centuries of repainting. You begin to connect the dots between the sacred symbols that survived, the sun disk, the ankh, the serpent, and realize they still carry their original meaning even when placed in the service of a different god. Imagine standing in a museum looking at a centuries-old statue that's been mislabeled for generations. The plaque tells you it's one thing, but your instincts and your research tell you it's something else entirely. That's the moment you reclaim not just the image, but the story. And the story is power. So here's a challenge for you. The next time you see a depiction of the divine, whether in art or text, ask yourself, what's missing? Whose features should be there but aren't? Which symbols are present? And where did they come from originally? Comment below with any examples you found, because the process of restoration begins with noticing. And once you notice, you can't go back. You can't unsee the truth that the divine once looked like you, or that it still does. Picture yourself in a dimly lit room. Scrolls stacked in every corner, the scent of ink and parchment filling the air. Outside, empires rise and fall, but in here, the real battle is being fought, not with swords, but with words. This is the realm where the gods are kept alive or killed forever. And in this place, translation is the weapon. You might think translation is just about swapping one language for another. But in the world of sacred texts, it's never that simple. Every translator is also an interpreter, and every interpretation carries bias, whether conscious or not. One word choice can alter the meaning of a passage. One omission can erase a lineage. One metaphor can hide a God's true face behind a veil of ambiguity. Imagine an original text describing a God as dark as the rich soil after the rains, a phrase meant to tie divinity to the land and the people of Africa. Now imagine a translator deciding to replace it with glorious in appearance or radiant in beauty. The description is still flattering, but the specific imagery is gone. The connection to blackness is severed in just a few strokes of ink. And it didn't happen once, it happened over and over across centuries, in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and beyond. By the time the text reached modern languages, entire layers of meaning were stripped away. The names of places were altered to sound less African. Tribal affiliations were erased, cultural references were replaced with ones more familiar to the dominant society of the time. Some of these changes were deliberate, serving political and religious agendas. Others were the result of translators simply not understanding the cultural context. But the result was the same. The divine history tied to black identity became harder to see, harder to claim, harder to pass down intact. Think of it like a painting that's been copied too many times. The first version is vivid and detailed. By the 10th copy, the lines are blurred, the colors faded. Eventually, you're looking at something that resembles the original in shape, but the soul of it is missing. That's what happened to the image of black gods through translation. Yet there's a strange twist. Sometimes, the truth survived in the margins. Literally, in old manuscripts, you can find tiny notes scribbled by monks and scholars preserving details that didn't make it into the main text. A comment about skin tone, a hint about the god's homeland, a description of rituals tied to African traditions. It's as if some translators couldn't bear to erase everything, leaving behind breadcrumbs for anyone willing to look. Today, those breadcrumbs matter more than ever. With modern tools, you can compare translations, dig into the original languages, and uncover what's been lost. You can trace how a word describing a burnished complexion morphed into something abstract, or how a reference to an African kingdom became simply a faraway land. And when you find those moments, it's like breaking open a tomb and seeing the God inside untouched by centuries of burial. It's proof that despite the layers of rewriting, the original still exists somewhere beneath. Now here's where you come in. When you hear a passage in a sacred text, ask yourself, what would this sound like in its oldest form? What imagery might have been removed? Which details feel too vague to be accidental? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because every time we restore one of these details, we bring the forgotten closer to the light. And the more light we bring, the harder it becomes for anyone to hide them again. Imagine a council chamber, not of priests alone, but of kings, generals, and scribes. The air is thick with the scent of burning incense, but the conversation is not about prayer, it's about control. In this room, religion is not just a matter of faith, it's a political strategy. And in this strategy, the image of the divine is the most valuable asset of all. The suppression of black divinity didn't happen in isolation. It was entangled with the power struggles of empires. The rulers of ancient states understood that whoever defined the god also defined the order of the world beneath that god. If your god looked like you, spoke your language, and shared your homeland, then your rule felt natural, destined, even divinely mandated. But if the god of the empire looked like someone else, the balance shifted. So, those in power began to reshape the divine in their own image. Not only did this diminish the legitimacy of black leadership, it also served to unify diverse territories under one spiritual figure, a figure chosen and controlled by the ruling class. In one move, they could weaken local traditions, centralize authority, and make loyalty to the ruler inseparable from loyalty to the god. This is why you see sudden changes in religious art and architecture following military conquests. Temples, once dedicated to African or Afro-influenced deities, were rededicated to foreign gods. Statues were recarved, inscriptions rewritten. The old gods didn't just lose their worshippers, they lost their names, their symbols, and eventually their place in memory. And yet, the old traditions didn't vanish without resistance. In the countryside, far from the political centers, people held on to fragments of the old faith. They hid their rituals inside the new ones. They gave old gods new names, whispering them in private, even as they mouthed the official prayers in public. This underground preservation was an act of quiet rebellion, but over generations, even the rebels began to forget the full truth of what they were protecting. You have to understand, the political motive wasn't simply to destroy, it was to absorb. By taking the power and attributes of black gods and giving them to the state's chosen deity, rulers could claim all the prestige of the old religion while erasing the people it came from. Imagine a king wearing a crown made from the melted gold of a rival's treasures. The gold is still there, but its story is gone. This is why modern readers are often shocked when they see the similarities between ancient African deities and the gods of other regions. It's not coincidence, it's inheritance without acknowledgement. And it happened because the political elite knew the value of those symbols. They knew that spiritual authority could be as decisive as military strength. When you see this pattern, you realize that religious history is inseparable from political history. Every translation, every alteration of a god's image, every official story was a political act. And the more you recognize that, the more you can read between the lines of the surviving records. Here's my question for you. How different would our world be if the political powers of history had chosen to preserve rather than erase the divine images of Africa? If, instead of one god replacing many, the pantheon had remained intact? Would we have a richer spiritual tapestry, or would the same forces have simply found another way to centralize control? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the conversation isn't just about history. It's about the systems we live under today. And if you can recognize the blueprint of control from the past, you can start to see it when it appears in the present.
You're walking along the edge of the Nile at dawn, the mist curling over the water, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Behind you, lush green fields stretch as far as the eye can see, fields that have fed empires for thousands of years. Ahead, the land grows drier, the horizon shifting from green to gold, and then to the stark, endless expanse of desert. You don't know it yet, but this is more than a change in scenery. It's a map of the spiritual shift that transformed the ancient world. For centuries, the gods of Africa were born from abundance. They were tied to rivers, forests, rains, and fertile soil. Their rituals celebrated harvests, honored the cycles of the moon, and mirrored the rhythm of the land. In these lush regions, the divine was experienced as a constant, nurturing presence, close enough to touch, woven into daily life. But as you move into the deserts, into the arid heartlands where resources are scarce and survival is hard, something changes. The gods here are not born from abundance, but from scarcity. They're distant, demanding, absolute. They don't walk among their people. They rule from the heavens. They are not one of many, sharing power. They are the one, requiring total devotion. It's no coincidence that some of the world's most influential monotheistic traditions emerged in these desert environments. In a land where survival depends on unity, the idea of one God, one law, one authority becomes a powerful unifying force. But that unity comes at a price. It requires the dismantling of other spiritual systems, especially those rooted in the lush, diverse landscapes of Africa. Over time, the stories of the African gods were either absorbed into this new desert-born theology or dismissed as pagan relics of a lesser past. The temples of many gods gave way to the singular house of one. Festivals honoring the earth's cycles were replaced with observances tied to fixed laws and distant revelations. And yet, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of the old ways hidden in the new. The imagery of rivers and gardens in sacred texts, the recurring symbolism of the sun, the lion, the serpent, all of which have deep African origins. These remnants are like fingerprints left behind by the gods who once reigned along the lush banks of the Nile and beyond. But here's what's haunting. You can feel the difference in the relationship. In the African spiritual world, the gods were kin. They reflected your face, your struggles, your joy. In the desert-born faiths, the God is above, separate, and all-powerful. The intimacy is replaced by hierarchy. The divine becomes a distant monarch, not a neighbor. This shift wasn't just theological, it was political. A distant God, mediated by an appointed priesthood or prophet, concentrates power. And when that God's image has been reshaped to erase African features, it reinforces a social order that pushes African people to the margins, not just of politics, but of divinity itself. So here's my question to you. What happens to a culture when its gods are taken away and replaced with one that doesn't look, sound, or feel like them? What happens to identity when the divine becomes foreign? That's not just history, it's psychology, and it's still happening in subtle ways today. Comment your thoughts below. Have you seen modern parallels where local traditions are replaced by imported beliefs, and what does it do to the people? Because the journey from temple to desert didn't just reshape the past, it set the blueprint for how spiritual landscapes can be conquered without ever raising a sword.
You've heard the phrase, God is universal. It's meant to be comforting, a way of saying that divinity belongs to everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from. But when you peel back the layers, you begin to see how universal has often been used as a mask, a way to hide the deliberate exclusion of entire spiritual lineages. Imagine this. You're told that the God in the sacred book is for all people, in all places, for all time. But when you look at the art, the descriptions, and the cultural context, you realize that this universal God consistently looks like the rulers, priests, and storytellers of one specific group. The message is subtle but clear. Yes, this God is for everyone, but only one people truly resemble them. This is where the mask of universalism becomes dangerous. On the surface, it promises equality. Beneath it, it enforces a hierarchy. The features, symbols, and traditions of African divinity are removed in the name of creating a God for all. But what remains is a God stripped of African identity, rebranded to fit a narrative that centers someone else's image. Think about how this plays out in history. When African gods were folded into monotheistic traditions, their specific names, attributes, and cultural markers were erased. The power they carried, the power of reflecting African people's sacred worth, was replaced with a version of divinity that felt foreign. And yet because this new God was called universal, the loss was harder to name. It didn't feel like erasure, it felt like inclusion. But inclusion without representation is still erasure. If you can no longer see yourself in the divine, you've been displaced from your own spiritual inheritance. The universal mask tells you that your God has been merged into something greater, but in reality, it's been overwritten. The symbols you once recognized are still there, just altered enough to hide their roots. The lion might remain, but it's no longer tied to the savanna. The sun still shines, but it's no longer the sun that rose over the Nile. What's striking is how often this strategy worked without open conflict. People accepted the new universal God because it came with the promise of unity, salvation, or moral order. Few questioned why their old stories were gone, why their festivals disappeared, why their gods had no more temples. And those who did question were often labeled heretics, rebels, or pagans. The mask of universalism is powerful because it doesn't force you to reject your past outright. It just makes you forget it. You stop noticing what's missing. You stop asking why the divine no longer feels familiar. And over generations, the memory fades, until the old gods are little more than whispers in folk tales or symbols in art that no one can quite explain. But here's the truth. When you lift that mask, the original faces are still there. The African gods still live in the metaphors, the parables, the hidden corners of sacred texts. The challenge is recognizing them, reclaiming them, and saying their names out loud. So I'll ask you this. When someone says God is universal, what image forms in your mind? Does it include the features of Africa's gods, or has the mask already done its work? Drop your answer in the comments, because until we start seeing through the mask, we can't begin the work of restoration.
Imagine walking into a grand cathedral or mosque, your eyes tracing the arches, the stained glass, the intricate calligraphy. The space feels holy, but look closer. Hidden in the carvings, in the patterns, in the ceremonial objects, are shapes and symbols that seem oddly familiar. A sun disk here, a serpent there, a lion crouched in the shadows of a column. These are not random decorations. They are the ghosts of older gods, still living inside the structures built to replace them. When the African gods were erased from official worship, their symbols were too powerful to simply vanish. People had prayed to them for thousands of years. Their imagery was woven into art, ritual, and architecture. To erase those symbols entirely would have meant tearing apart the very fabric of spiritual life. So instead, the new powers found another way. They kept the symbols, but rewrote their meanings. The Ankh, once a sacred sign of life in the Nile Valley, became a decorative cross. The lion, symbol of divine strength in Nubian and Ethiopian traditions, was recast as a generic emblem of courage or royal authority. The serpent, once linked to wisdom and rebirth in African cosmologies, was reframed as the embodiment of evil. The same shapes remained, but their stories had been inverted. This wasn't just clever, it was strategic. By reassigning meaning, the new religion could absorb the spiritual power of the old gods while breaking the cultural connection that gave them their identity. Worshippers could keep seeing the symbols they had always known, but instead of reminding them of their ancestral gods, those symbols now reinforced the authority of the new divine order. You can see this in sacred texts as well. Images and metaphors with deep African roots are still present, but they've been reinterpreted to fit the new narrative. A river that once symbolized the life-giving power of an African goddess becomes a poetic stand-in for the blessings of the universal God. A festival marking the flooding of the Nile becomes a seasonal harvest celebration with no mention of its divine origins. But here's the thing. The human mind remembers, even when the official story changes. In some rural villages, elders still whispered the old interpretations. A carved lion might be blessed in a Christian procession, but to the oldest members of the crowd, it still carried the spirit of Apedemak, the lion-headed god of Nubia. These moments of quiet resistance kept fragments of the old ways alive for generations.
And now, with access to global archives, museum collections, and archaeological findings, you can start to reverse the process. You can look at a symbol and trace it back through time, peeling away each new layer of meaning until you uncover its original African origin. You can see how the serpent went from sacred to cursed, how the sun disk was hidden in halos, how the Ankh was absorbed into new iconography. The challenge is that once you see the original, you can't unsee it. The next time you enter a place of worship or read a sacred text, you'll notice the fingerprints of African gods everywhere. You'll recognize that the symbols have been turned against themselves, stripped of their lineage to serve a narrative that erases the people who created them. So here's what I want you to do. Pick one symbol you've seen in religious art or architecture and research its oldest known meaning. Then share it in the comments. Because every time we restore the story of a symbol, we chip away at the mask that hides the truth. And once enough of us see clearly, those symbols might finally point back to the gods who gave them life in the first place. Picture a small fire burning in the center of a village at night. Around it, elders sit with children, telling stories under a sky thick with stars. The air is cool, the night quiet, except for the crackle of wood and the rhythm of the storyteller's voice. These stories aren't written anywhere. They live only in the memory of the people who carry them. And in these words, spoken softly but firmly, the old gods survive. When the temples fell and the statues were buried, the official record may have erased the black gods, but the bloodline of memory kept them alive. Through oral tradition, art, and ritual, fragments of the divine legacy endured. A harvest song might secretly praise an earth goddess whose name had been banned. A wedding dance might echo the steps of an ancient fertility ritual. A pattern woven into a cloth might be the symbol of a deity disguised as decoration. This wasn't nostalgia, it was survival. In a world where open worship could mean persecution, people learned to hide the sacred in plain sight. A hymn sung in church might sound like it praises the accepted God, but in the oldest dialect, certain phrases would have a double meaning, calling on an older, darker-skinned protector. A carving of a saint might carry features that mirrored an ancient African deity carved by an artisan who remembered, or whose teacher remembered, or whose grandmother told him the story when he was small. And art became the safest vault for memory. Pottery painted with certain colors, jewelry shaped in familiar forms, tattoos etched into the skin, all of these carried messages that only the initiated could read. Even in the diaspora, when African people were scattered across continents, they carried these visual codes with them. On new soil, under new masters, they adapted them to local customs, but the essence remained. The rituals, too, were vessels of preservation. The way water was poured in a blessing, the way hands were raised to the sky, the way certain animals were honored, these were threads that led back to the old gods. The names might have been lost, but the actions spoke in the language of centuries. This is why, even in places where the official religion had been established for generations, you could still find traces of the old ways, if you knew where to look. A funerary chant in the Caribbean with the cadence of West African mourning songs. A rural Ethiopian festival with costumes and dances that predate Christianity. A proverb from a desert village that turns out to be a fragment of an ancient creation myth. The memory in the bloodline is stubborn. It refuses to die quietly. Even when cut off from its source, it flows in the stories people tell their children, in the art they hang in their homes, in the rituals they perform without even realizing their true age. Here's the question for you. What memories might be hiding in your own traditions? Have you ever seen a symbol, a gesture, or a song in your culture that felt older than the religion it's now tied to? Share it in the comments. Because every time we recognize these echoes, we strengthen the chain of memory that connects us to the forgotten gods. And the more we speak these fragments out loud, the less likely they are to be lost again. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing you can't remember your own childhood. You know you had one. You have faint impressions of it, flashes of color, a half-heard lullaby, but the details are gone. The faces are blurred. The places feel unreal. Now imagine that this amnesia isn't just yours. It's shared by an entire people. That is what happened when the memory of the black gods was cut away. This is spiritual amnesia. It doesn't arrive suddenly. It seeps in over generations until the absence feels normal. At first, you still have the stories, the songs, the rituals, but you're told they're just tradition with no divine weight. Then you forget the stories altogether, and only the motions remain. Eventually, even those fade, until the old ways survive only in fragments that no one can fully understand. You see it in the way sacred sites become ruins instead of living temples. You see it when a symbol, once recognized instantly, now requires an explanation in a museum. You see it when the language that carried the prayers dies, and with it, the ability to speak directly to the divine in the tongue of your ancestors. This kind of forgetting is powerful because it breaks the link between identity and destiny. If you no longer know that your people once walked with gods who looked like you stop expecting greatness from yourself. You stop seeing your features as sacred, your culture as divine. You accept the stories handed to you by those in power because you don't remember that your own people once wrote their own. And here's the cruel part. Spiritual amnesia often disguises itself as progress. You're told that the old gods were primitive, that you've moved on to something higher, purer, more universal. The loss feels like growth. The forgetting feels like enlightenment. But it's only because you've been taught to measure yourself by someone else's standard. Sometimes, the only reminders of the old faith are buried in folklore, myths that sound like children's stories, but are really faded memories of divine beings. A tale about a wise old woman in the forest who helps lost travelers might be the last shadow of a powerful earth goddess. A nursery rhyme about the river might be the final echo of a water deity once worshipped with offerings and songs. This kind of amnesia is not irreversible, but it requires deliberate effort to heal. You have to dig. You have to seek out the elders who still remember, even if their memories are incomplete. You have to read the oldest versions of the stories, compare them across cultures. Look for the fingerprints of African divinity in unexpected places. And most importantly, you have to speak the names again. Even if you're not certain you're pronouncing them exactly as they once were, the act of speaking them breaks the silence. It reminds your mind, your body, your spirit that these gods existed, that they mattered, and that they still matter. So I'll ask you, what's one tradition you know from your family or culture that feels older than its current form? Could it be a fragment of something deeper? Share it in the comments, because every story we reclaim pushes back against the amnesia. Every name we speak is a step toward remembering. And remember, forgetting was never our choice, but remembering is.
It starts as a spark, small, almost imperceptible. Maybe it's a word in an old song that catches your ear. Maybe it's a symbol on a wall that feels strangely familiar. Maybe it's a conversation with someone who remembers the old ways in fragments. That's how reawakening begins, not with thunder, but with a flicker. And once that flicker takes hold, it spreads like fire. Across the world, people of African descent are beginning to look back, really look back, beyond the layers of colonization, forced religion, and rewritten history.
They're finding the traces of their gods in museum cases, in dusty archives, in the whispered stories of elders who never forgot. They're piecing together the pantheon that was broken apart, restoring not just names, but the dignity those names carried. This isn't nostalgia, it's reclamation. To reawaken Black spiritual pride is to confront centuries of conditioning that told you your gods were lesser, your stories irrelevant, your culture primitive. It's to stand before the world and say, our gods walked before yours, our temples stood before yours, our stories shaped yours, and they will stand again. The reawakening doesn't look the same for everyone. For some, it's a return to traditional African religions, Ifa, Vodun, Kemetic spirituality, practiced openly after generations of secrecy. For others, it's about weaving African imagery and concepts back into the religions they still follow, reclaiming the heritage that was hidden inside them all along. Some find it in art, painting the gods with the skin tones and features history tried to erase. Others find it in scholarship, digging into the archaeological and linguistic evidence that links African divinity to the oldest layers of the so-called world religions. What makes this moment powerful is that it's happening collectively. The internet has become the modern village fire. People across continents are comparing notes, sharing sources, translating old texts, and discovering that what they thought were isolated fragments are actually parts of the same whole. A drum rhythm in Ghana echoes in the Caribbean. A goddess in Sudan shares symbols with one in West Africa. A proverb in Ethiopia mirrors a saying in the African diaspora. But reawakening isn't just about uncovering the past, it's about using it to reshape the future. When people see themselves reflected in the divine, they carry themselves differently. They resist systems that tell them they are less. They teach their children that their culture is sacred, their history is sacred, their existence is sacred. And yes, there will be resistance. Systems that have benefited from the erasure of Black divinity won't welcome its return. There will be accusations of idolatry, heresy, or going backward. But here's the truth. Going backwards is sometimes the only way to move forward if the road ahead was built on lies. You might feel that spark yourself right now, listening to this. Maybe it's curiosity. Maybe it's recognition. Maybe it's a feeling you can't explain, but you know it's pulling you towards something deeper. Follow it. Read the names of the gods out loud. Look for their images. Ask the questions no one around you is asking. And if you've already started this journey, share what you found in the comments, because your spark might be the one that ignites someone else's flame. And the more flames we light, the closer we come to burning away the shadows that kept these gods hidden for so long. The reawakening is here. The only question is, will you answer it?
You're standing in a hall lined with statues, their faces chipped but still powerful. Some bear crowns shaped like the sun, others hold staffs carved with serpents, lions, or lotus blossoms. Each one feels like a door to a world that's been locked away. This is the Ebony Pantheon, once the spiritual backbone of entire civilizations, now scattered across continents, fragmented in museums, hidden in archives. And the work of restoration begins with gathering the pieces. Restoring the memory of Black gods is not about nostalgia or romanticizing the past. It's about correcting the record. It's about pulling these deities out of the footnotes of history and placing them where they belong, at the center of the global spiritual narrative. That means identifying them by their original names, understanding their domains, tracing their connections to the land and the people who honored them. It also means challenging the way religion has been taught for centuries. If you've been told that the divine has only one face, one culture, one point of origin, restoration shatters that illusion. It forces you to see that the gods of Africa were not local or tribal figures. They were universal before universal became a tool for erasure. They were part of a vast, interconnected spiritual network that influenced civilizations far beyond the Nile, the Sahara, or the Sahel. The work of restoration happens on many fronts. Historians dig through archaeological evidence, re-examining artifacts that were mislabeled to strip away their African identity. Linguists trace sacred words back to their African roots, uncovering how they were adopted and altered in other languages. Artists breathe life back into the gods by painting them as they truly were, skin dark as river mud, eyes bright as desert stars, adorned in the colors of the continent. Communities are also creating spaces for worship and remembrance. Shrines are being rebuilt, rituals revived, festivals reimagined. In some places, ceremonies are performed exactly as they were centuries ago. In others, they are adapted to modern life, blending ancient symbols with contemporary forms of expression. But restoration is also internal. It's not enough to know these gods existed. You have to feel their presence again, to let their stories take root in your imagination. You have to see them not as artifacts, but as living forces that shaped and can still shape the world. That means teaching children their names, telling them the myths, showing them that divinity can and does look like them. Of course, restoration isn't without its challenges. The historical record has been so manipulated that reconstructing these pantheons often feels like solving a puzzle with missing pieces. There are disagreements about origins, names, and timelines, but these debates are part of the process. They keep the gods alive in conversation rather than leaving them buried in silence. And here's the most important part. Restoration is not just about the past. It's about reclaiming the future. When a people see themselves reflected in the divine, they walk with a different kind of confidence. They are harder to control, harder to convince that their culture is less than anyone else's. So ask yourself, what would the world look like if the ebony pantheon were restored in full? If Osiris, Hathor, Epidemic, and countless others stood alongside the gods of Greece, Rome, and Israel in every history book and every classroom? What would it mean for children to grow up knowing that their ancestors didn't just survive history, they shaped the divine order itself? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the restoration of these gods is not a solo mission, it's a collective one. And every voice that calls their names brings them one step closer to the place they once held.
You're standing at the edge of a new threshold. Behind you lies the long road we've walked, through deserts and rivers, across temples and ruins, into stories whispered in the dark. You've seen how the gods of Africa were erased, rewritten, absorbed, and disguised. You've seen how their symbols were inverted, their skin lightened, their names changed. And you've also seen how, against all odds, they survived, in art, in rituals, in memory, in blood. Now, ahead of you, the road forks. One path leads back into the forgetting, into the silence that benefits those who control the narrative. The other path leads forward, into the unfinished journey of restoration. And here's the truth. This work will not be completed in our lifetime. But it will not begin at all unless people like you take the first steps. Restoring the forgotten glory of Black spirituality means committing to 3 things: uncovering the truth, speaking it aloud, and living as if that truth matters. It means refusing to accept universal as a synonym for erased. It means teaching your children that their ancestors shaped the sacred just as much as anyone else's. It means questioning every image, every story, every translation you've been given, and asking, whose hand shaped this? Whose voice was silenced here? This journey is also about connection. The African gods are not relics. They're threads in a vast spiritual web that ties together people, places, and histories across the globe. When you speak their names, you're not just calling on the past, You're linking yourself to a network of memory and power that has been waiting for centuries to be reawakened. And yes, there will be resistance. You will meet those who dismiss this work as irrelevant, divisive, or even dangerous. But that resistance is proof of its importance. Power does not fight to suppress what is trivial. As you stand here, you have to decide, will you be a passive observer of history, or will you be part of the restoration? Will you leave the ebony pantheon in the shadows, or will you help bring it back into the light? Because the truth is, these gods are not gone. They are only waiting for their names to be spoken, waiting for their images to be restored, waiting for the day when their place in the spiritual story of humanity is recognized again. So, are you ready to keep exploring this journey? If what we uncovered tonight made you rethink everything you thought you knew about history and religion, don't hesitate to share your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Let me know what you think about this buried truth. And don't forget to hit like, so this message reaches others searching for answers too. This journey has only just begun, and if you truly want to go deeper, subscribe and hit the bell. The next secrets might just change everything, and I want you to be the first to hear them.